This is the Flyerdelphia podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heenan. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome into another edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined tonight by Rob Riches, and this week, first time in a while for us. It's been a little stretch of time. We've been on a bit of a hiatus here, just trying to get some scheduling things worked out. We do apologize for that. We know a lot of you have been eagerly anticipating our latest episode, especially with the last few weeks going the way they have for the Flyers. Where do we begin really with this? Because, a few weeks ago when we did our last show, this was a team that was kind of hanging in there, kind of in between, just like all the other teams in the Metro, really, at the time. It was roughly a 500 team. They had just come off of a couple of good wins. They had just played, we really didn't have a whole lot to complain about at one point in time. And then we were talking about a couple of tough losses, a couple things like that. And now we are stuck in the middle, I should say. We're stuck in the middle of talking about a losing streak that has spanned over 3 weeks now, or over 2 weeks, I'm sorry. If you go back to the November 9th game against the Chicago Blackhawks, where the Flyers last won, that was a 3-1 win. And then from there, 7 straight losses, of course, coming to a head here with the loss on Friday in the annual Black Friday game, 5-4 in overtime to the New York Islanders. And really, this losing streak is just something at this point that it's becoming increasingly frustrating as the games go on, mainly because of the fact that at some point in time, the Flyers should have done something at this point to find a way to finish off a game. You look at the 2-goal leads that they held one in Winnipeg. A little bit of a different example. The Flyers took an early 2-0 lead, gave up a goal in the second period, gave up the game-tying goal in the final minute, but that was really as close as they've come to really actually winning a game in regulation. Even the 2 games in overtime since, where they had 2-goal leads, one against Calgary last Saturday, and the game on Friday also against the Islanders, where they had two-goal leads. This is a team that in that particular moment had trouble finishing off, even so much as finishing off a period. They took a 3-1 lead in the first period against Calgary, gave up 3 goals in the second period, and even though they answered with one of their own, it ties a game 4-4. That was the scores that went to overtime. Same thing really with Friday's game. The only difference is that the 2 goals, it came in the third period instead of the second period to even things up. And the Flyers took a 4-2 lead to the third period with 20 minutes to go in a game where you really have to have 2 points. And not only just have 2 points, but not allow the other team to get any points in return as well. And that's where the Flyers are. So at this point in time, we've watched this team over the last few weeks slip into the cellar of the Metropolitan Division, slip really low into the standings, and while it's a young team and there's going to be growing pains, there's an element of frustration, mainly because of the fact, and these are things we're all going to talk about during the show tonight, but there's an element of frustration because of the fact that the team really never identified themselves as that young team, growing, rebuilding, so to speak. The word rebuilding never came up, and that's a big problem with an understanding of where this team is. A lot of people can see it at this point. It's a team that's trying to rebuild and trying to get their young players acclimated to the NHL game. No question about it. But it's a team that also needs to accept that status. They need to accept that that's where they are. And Ron Hextall won't say it. He'll say that the players that they have are good enough to be a borderline playoff team. So expectations sit a little higher than they would typically for any rebuilding team. As I bring in Rob here on this, to get his thoughts kind of on everything here. Rob, what's your thoughts of just the last couple weeks here? The losing streak reaching 7 games, the fact that this team is going to have 2 really difficult games back-to-back this week to open things up, not to mention that they cap off the week also with Boston, who's been on a bit of a roll lately, and just kind of everything else with the team's identity. We kind of have discussed back and forth a little bit. Yeah, it's a young team, but what are your thoughts just on the way this losing streak has played out and where the team is after a few weeks since we've been on to talk about it?
What I'm going to start off with here, Kevin, is that this streak kind of, you mentioned this podcast hiatus earlier, which, it's something where We have this podcast hiatus, which started right around the time that this skid began. So maybe we're responsible. I do take full responsibility. I do apologize to our loyal Flyers fans, and I do promise we will not let it happen again. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. Who knows? But on a serious note, it's one of those things where it's frustrating. You absolutely hit the nail on the head. It's frustrating. When you're a young club, a veteran club, a cup contender, even a basement dweller. Nobody wants to lose 7 games in a row. It's one of those things. You go out there night after night. You want to win games. The games that look winnable. You have a lead brewing in the third period, and all of a sudden you squander that and end up going in overtime and losing there. It's frustrating. It's those kinds of losses. They can really take a toll on a team, especially a younger club like the Flyers. So it's one of those things where it definitely gets frustrating, and you just gotta one of those things. They're on their way to gotta find a way to work themselves out of that. It's not an ideal situation for anybody to be in, especially a young club like the Flyers. It's something that you hate to see, and it's one of the. So these things just that they'll happen time to time. Losing streaks are part of the game. It happens, but it's they're just they got their opportunities to kind of work themselves through this and. Try not to let it mount too much. You don't want to get to a point where it's affecting everybody's psyche out there on the team.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I want to point out is that when this losing streak started, back on November 11th, the first game of the losing streak was the 1-0 shutout loss to Minnesota on home ice. And it's kind of, to me, I look at that game, and if you only knew that was the start of this, it really is. Not to say it didn't seem like that was where it was going to go, but you looked at that game, and for a while here, I looked at a lot of these games on the losing streak and thought there's positives out of it. You can put a bit of a positive spin on some of this. The 1-0 loss was certainly close, and when you lose a game 1-0, you sometimes just have to tip your hat to the opposing goalie. You look at everything, you don't think too much about it. A second straight shutout loss on the road to Minnesota was very frustrating. The way that they lost the game in Winnipeg, with that eventually going to a shootout, that was frustrating. The overtime loss to Calgary, that was frustrating. And those losses were frustrating more or less because of the fact that they were there. You had the feeling, okay, these games are there for the taking. The Winnipeg game especially, you're down to the final minute. If you can just find a way to hold off the opponent for another 60 seconds, you've snapped a streak that's not even really as much of a losing streak. It was 2 games at that point. You're not having the same conversations. Then you get to the Calgary game. You finally come out with some offense in the first period. You finally kind of put to bed some of the demons of the lack of scoring that was there. And it all gets squandered away with a second period that was very undisciplined, that was very... It showed signs of the youthfulness of this team, I guess with the lack of discipline, but the penalty killing was just atrocious. And there's not much you can say other than that. The game against Vancouver the following Tuesday was just an absolute mess from start to finish. The game against the Islanders on the second half of a back-to-back was better on that. This was this game on the Wednesday night. For a road game on a back-to-back, better. Certainly a good effort, but it's about finishing, and you kind of wanted to see the team turn a corner right there by playing a team from their own conference. You got to remember, you're playing teams you see twice a year for so much of this, and the lack of really knowing the opponent. The game against Chicago was a good revenge game. They got the win. Then they come back-to-back against Minnesota, the game against Winnipeg, Calgary, Vancouver, and finally you're at the end of a stretch where you played Western Conference teams for 10 games in a row, and it's kind of the last 5 games of that did not go as planned, but you're back to playing the East. You're back to being in a spot where you can actually dictate the amount of points that your rivals are getting, and it's been a lot of missed assignments, a lot of overtime struggles we've seen from missed assignments, things like that. It's not all one thing, I think, is the big thing about this team, is that it's not like there's one glaring area. The penalty kill has been bad over the last stretch. They've not been very good in overtime, and that's just missed assignments. Defensively, it's a young grouping of 6 that have been playing lately. You have to kind of be patient with it, and that's not the wrong answer here. It's not, sitting here and looking at a team in a 7-game losing streak and saying be patient, it's not a wrong answer, but you do need to snap out of it at some point in time. And like I said, I think that one big thing that's a problem with this team is the fact that from the very beginning, Ron Hextall would not sit there and come out and go, it's a rebuilding team. He came out and said it was a team that he thought had the chance to be a playoff team. And that's all well and good. It's good to have confidence in your team, but at the same time, it's a team that hasn't been, aside from the top line, there's no consistency either. And especially when you look at injuries that have hurt the team, the fact that going into, first of all, I guess when you're in the middle of a 7-game losing streak, and Rob, you can kind of back me up on this or disagree, feel free to, but I guess when you're on a 7-game losing streak, the last thing you want to see on your schedule next is a road game against the defending Stanley Cup champions and your cross-state rivals. Wouldn't you agree?
I think it's one of those things where it seems daunting at first, but at the same time, it's one of those things where, what better opportunity you have a chance to snap the streak?
Yeah, it is, and this is normally the type of team that they come out against and play with a little bit more urgency, with a little bit more passion, and that's all well and good. I don't think there's a lack of passion on this team. I think there's a lack of execution. I think there's a lack of, like we said, discipline, missing assignments. Mistakes are going to happen with a young team, and look, I'll be honest right now. I'm trying to be as rational as possible about it. The thing I have trouble grasping is the fact that you want to keep talking about the playoffs. You want to keep this mindset going right now as a fan base that the GM at the very beginning of the year came out and said this is a team that should be in the running for a playoff spot. And that's not really false right now, but when you look at the last 7 games collectively, it's hard to find a reason to believe that too. What do you think, Rob?
It's funny because I was reading something the other day. I think it was a quote from Ken Holland in Detroit that the conventional wisdom is basically that the teams that have the best shot at playoff contention are the teams that are pretty much in it in the standings right around American Thanksgiving. So it's one of those things where obviously, we've seen what could happen. Obviously, teams can turn things around December, January, February, March. Really start to play better, make that run, climb up the standings, and and obviously that American Thanksgiving mindset, that's not set in stone.
Right. And look, I'll be quick to point out, and it's a very different team. It's a younger team, but I'll be quick to point out that it was around this time last year that the Flyers were a very similar team, really. The records were pretty close through the same number of games. We're up to 23 games completed now. And last season, the Flyers were 10-10-3. They're 8-9-6 this time around. But realistically, that's a difference of 1 point in the standings, no matter how you swing it. Through 23 games, they had 23 points last year. They have 22 this year. And I'm not trying to compare the two teams here because that's apples to oranges at this point. But I look at this and I go, remember around this time last year, actually, ironically enough, I'm looking at it right now in front of me. The date was November 27th, which is the same date that the Flyers will be back on the ice on Monday night to face the Penguins, that they won a game against Calgary 5-3, and it was the start of a stretch of 10 games won in a row, that suddenly, over the course of 10 games, vaulted the Flyers from 23 points to 43 that quickly, and put them right up in the running near the top of the Metropolitan Division. It's not impossible here, but the Flyers also before that didn't have a losing streak of more than 3 games in a row over the course of that time to that point in the season. So for them to lose 7 in a row the way they have, and yes, they've gone to overtime quite a bit during this stretch. You have the 2 games against the Islanders, both went to overtime. They went to overtime against Calgary. They went to a shootout against Winnipeg. And all of that factors in. Yes, they are getting points, but, and I wrote this on Saturday for the site. Moral victories, you start losing moral victories the longer a losing streak goes. When this started after back-to-back shutout losses, going to a shootout and still getting a point, yeah, you were close to winning, but going to a shootout, that's a little bit of one. The game against Calgary was weird, and it was a tough third period, tied the whole way through. That, you could kind of give them a little bit of props for doing that. I feel the same way about the first game against the Islanders too, a game that was tied all the way through the third period. You had to kill off a couple penalties. You did a good job of that. You got it to overtime, and you just wish you had a little bit of a longer chance than 32 seconds to make something happen in overtime. The problem here is just strictly finishing games. It's hard to look at the Calgary game completely without remembering that after 20 minutes, that was a 3-1 game. You look at the Winnipeg game. Everything started to line up your way. You're within a minute of finishing it off. And who knows? The thing is that you look at those games individually and you kind of look back on them now, it's as if, well, what happens if they do finish off the game against Winnipeg? Does that change the course of the next 3-4 games that have happened since? Same thing with the Calgary game. Does that change the course of the next 3 games? It's a tough way to look at it. I didn't think that the team was ready to play at all in that Tuesday game against Vancouver. The lineups have been a bit of a mess as well, not necessarily with getting the youth injected into it, because I do think, and one thing I want to talk to you about, Rob, is the addition of some younger players who have been recently added, because I do think that Danik Martel has been a difference maker to an extent in these first couple games he's played, just because he's adding speed and determination to a line that generally lacked it. And I'm not saying not to take anything away from Martel playing with Nolan Patrick and Wayne Simmons, 2 guys who certainly have had their share of struggles with their own health over the course of the season. But you saw something different from those lines in the last couple of games that Martel has played, and that did make a difference. I don't feel this. I wish I could feel the same way about the other lines on this team, the third and even the fourth at this point, because you're trying to inject different players into it. The practice on Sunday featured Dale Weiss and Yuri Laterra in the lineup again. That to me is a mistake. The team was playing better without them in the lineup. I thought that you just kind of need to stick with these new combinations, maybe even mix some things back up and go back to groupings that were playing at the very beginning of the year and see how that works. The thing the Flyers are finally getting back with this game on Monday is Andrew McDonald. And really, a lot of people want to throw their hands up, want to kind of, cover their eyes, shield their eyes over the fact that Andrew McDonald coming back is going to make for more unwatchable hockey. I completely disagree. I think you've noticed over the course of the games that McDonald has missed, you've watched the defense get more worn down than they have been when he was around. I think Ivan Provorov's game has taken a bit of a hit without McDonald because of the fact that Provorov's been asked to really shoulder the workload defensively, and he was before then, but McDonald being there allowed him to be not less responsible defensively, but to not have to do it all defensively. And nothing against Robert Haig. He's had a really good start to the year, but he was really good on a pairing with Shane Gostisbehere, and from the time McDonald's been out, that pair was broken up. You've watched Brandon Manning have to play with several different partners defensively. He's played with Gostisbehere. He was playing with Travis Sanheim. I believe Manning at one point in time or another was taking shifts with Sam Moran for a brief period out there, or Radko Gudas when Gudas before his suspension came into play. There's a lot of different shuffling going on here. Rob, what do you think with McDonald coming back, with the team basically having a completely clean bill of health, with the exception of Gudas being out with the suspension still? What combinations are you thinking would be the best to go to?
It is interesting that you bring that up, because it's one of those things where, at first glance, a lot of people can look at that and think, oh, they lose 7 games in a row and McDonald comes back. When it rains, it pours. But it's one of those things where the big thing that bringing Andrew McDonald back into the fold, it gives the Flyers that stability, that veteran stability and veteran presence back in the lineup, and especially with Radko Gudas going down for basically, trying to, I guess you could say, decapitate Matthew Perreault. I don't know what the hell that was, but it's one of those things where with him out of the lineup, there is no veteran presence. The most veteran guys in the defensive group now, both of those guys out are Gostisbehere and Brandon Manning, and it's one of those things where that's a very young, very raw defense. So it's one of those things where you bring Andrew McDonald back into the fold, and that immediately adds some veteran presence to it. So, if you want to talk about potential pairings or pairings that you could like to see result from that, obviously Provorov and McDonald, they've complemented each other very well when they've played together. And going off of that, put Robert Haig back with Shane Gostisbehere. Those are 2 guys who, obviously kind of the two-way game of Haig and the the flashy offensive from the flashy offensive upside from Gostisbehere. Those pair pretty well together, and then either some combination of Sanheim, Moran, and Manning. Maybe give Moran more of a look out there. Maybe him and Sanheim together with Manning as the extra guy is something that could work out pretty well. That's something I wouldn't mind seeing. But for the most part, yeah, once you get McDonald back, you get that veteran stability, and that's how you can help right the ship.
Yeah, and what about the forwards for you too? Because with the way that, like I said, the practice today kind of indicated that that Jordan Weal and Taylor Lee are going to sit on Monday, and Yuri Laterra and Dale Weiss are going to come back in. To me, that just seems like it's going to create even more chaos. You had some lines working pretty well. I still think Lear and Lawton work really well together on the fourth line. I thought with Weal out there was a little bit of an added element that could potentially work for them. And then the third line, too, being what it is. I don't know if you want to pull a guy like... that's two fourth liners technically coming out of the picture if you want to look at the way the lines were on Friday. But in reality here, you're talking about the line of Raffl, Filppula, and you're going to throw probably, I would imagine Dale Weiss is going to get the increased role more than anybody else, and you're going to bump somebody else back. And it's a shame because it'd probably be, Travis Konechny's the odd man out in that grouping at that point because Martel, Patrick, and Simmons are a line. You're not breaking up your first line, and that's understandable. But where would you kind of cycle everybody in? Because I don't know if I agree with any of this at all, and I didn't agree with there was an overtime combination of the trio in overtime at one point during Friday's game against the Islanders was Giroux, Filppula, and Manning. And I understand you're really desperate for veteran presence on the blue line with McDonald still not available, but that's desperation, and it screams score a goal on us, as soon as possible. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the forward combinations too.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you could convince me, and I can understand a reasonable argument for Dale Weiss or Yuri Laterra to come back into the lineup. One of those guys, I don't see a point in bringing both of those guys back in. It's one of those things where, like you're saying, that forces Travis Konechny to be the odd man out that just kind of, messes everything up. It's one of those things where you have Konechny who is kind of, struggling a little bit. It's evident, and I just don't see that really kind of helping his confidence out whatsoever. So it's one of those things where, you kind of want one of those guys to kind of just you kind of want that presence in there, but at the same time, I don't see. I think that's just overkill when you bring both of those guys in.
That, and I think it defeats the purpose at this point because in the middle of the 7-game losing streak that they're on right now, you've got a team that is at least trying to utilize younger players and grow them. At the same time, as I say that, I feel like they strayed from that in Friday's game. Toward the end, I didn't remember seeing a lot of Martel down the stretch. I don't believe that I believe it was about almost 2.5 minutes of overtime. I don't recall seeing Martel, Konechny, Weal, anybody who you think would be a bit of a play driver. I didn't even see Wayne Simmons on the ice in overtime. If he was, it was for a very brief shift that didn't last very long because he tried to quickly shuffle the lines again. I know I saw the Giroux, Filppula, and Manning trio a few times, and I know that Couturier, Voracek, and Provorov played at a time, but you left so many quality guys on the bench, and just because you had the Filppula Giroux combination among forwards floating in your mind. See, this is, to me, where Dave Haxtell gets questioned so much, and this is why people are starting to get fed up with him as well. And this is where I do understand it to an extent. When he puts the combinations out there like that, you're sitting there going, you're kind of misusing the players you have. If you want to utilize youth in the way that you're trying to, and while the word rebuilding hasn't been said, if you want to try to treat it like that and you want to put guys out there who are going to get a learning experience, then you need to be playing Konechny and Weal and even Martel and Nolan Patrick and guys like that in overtime and doing it for more than 20 seconds at a clip here. You got to put them out there for some decent minutes in late game situations, in clutch situations, and see if they've got that in their game. It's hard to learn anything about a player when he's sitting on the bench in front of you, and you're going to sit there and tell me, Jordan Weal's going to get valuable experience by sitting in the press box. I believe that to some extent, but after what? Putting him on the fourth line and using him for 8 minutes in the last game, that doesn't help a player's confidence at all. It just kind of further frustrates them and further pushes them into a hole that's harder to get out of. And that's the type of hole that the entire team is in, because Konechny is bordering on breaking out, but hasn't been able to finish on some of his chances. Wheel has struggled lately. You've got, guys like Nolan Patrick and Danik Martel and all these guys who are younger, who are very close to doing very big positive things that just can't seem to find the way to finish. And it's not their fault that they can't finish as younger players. It will come at some point. And truth be told, for veteran guys who have been struggling to finish, and you look at Wayne Simmons and Shane Gostisbehere as two guys who hadn't scored in a while, who finally get goals on Friday, it seemed to loosen them up a little bit, or at least get some emotion out of them, draws a little less, takes a little bit of the frustration and the sting away from being so frustrated. But I think they would both trade the goals they scored if the margin, or if the final score was 3-2 and the Flyers won the game as opposed to 5-4 losing in overtime. That's the way that it goes right now. But this is where Dave Haxtell gets questioned so much. He's supposed to be, and I'm starting to see this. You want to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. You want to give Ron Hextall the benefit of the doubt with development of young players. But I'm starting to really struggle to see how this whole plan comes together in certain parts when you don't play the rookies not saying all the time, but the minutes are here and there. You see them, one guy gets a lot of minutes one night and the next night he's limited. That doesn't help a player's psyche at all. And as a head coach, the line combinations just don't scream chemistry. They don't scream knowing the team. They don't scream motivating the team. And they don't scream a learning experience really for the team. I haven't seen Haxtell do anything that shows me that he's actually out there trying to develop the player. I see him trying to make do with what he has because the team wants to believe that they're in contention, but they're slipping further out of contention, really. And at that point, you might as well just at that point just go screw it. Let's put the lines together we really think are going to work here, or that seem to work and have the best chemistry, and maybe it'll actually turn the season around. You do have time to turn it around, but you're running thin on it. So there's a lot of things that go into it, and that's why I think the team doesn't have an identity. Because to me, yeah, you can sit here and say the identity is this team is some nights good, some nights bad. It's a Jekyll and Hyde effect. It's not really, because this team comes out, can have a good game, may not have a good game, but they don't know what kind of team they are. Are they rebuilding? Are they not? Are they a contender? Are they not? You got a GM who thinks they should be able to at least challenge for a playoff spot. In reality, we're watching a team that's rebuilding. I'm confused by it. I don't know what I should be going into, but right now I know that I look at a schedule that has Pittsburgh, San Jose, and Boston on the schedule for the week ahead, and then a West Coast trip, or a Canadian West Coast trip that's against dangerous teams in their own right as well. I'm not so sure that this isn't going to drag on for a couple more games here at least. At some point in time, every team finds a way to snap out of it, but I'm not so sure. So, I mean, Rob, what are your thoughts on kind of everything, the identity aspect, what Haxtall's doing? I know, look, you can't say anything anymore without people saying fire Haxtall, but, is that really the answer at this stage of the season? Is it the end of the season? Like, is this has potential for him for this to be kind of the final straw? Because his seat should be heating up if this continues, but he's got to find a way to pull this team out of it in their own way. So what are you thinking?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, when you talk about the rebuild, it's one of those things where, to me, it always kind of felt like, they're not going to come out and say that it's a rebuild, but it's kind of that tacitness that it is a rebuild, that it is a rebuilding club. When you're putting out a young club out there on the ice night after night, your end game is more or less to just kind of develop those guys and make some progress on these draft picks that, that he stockpiled over the past few years, and, really kind of, make some headway with them. And if they're able to get into the playoffs, that's fantastic, because obviously, as the old cliche goes, you get in, pretty much anything can happen in the Stanley Cup playoffs. So it's one of those things where that's kind of why Ron Hextall wants to build a borderline playoff team. But, at the same time, it's one of those things where even if they miss out on that, even if they just barely, miss out or just get into the first round even and get swept out, it's one of those things where that's still kind of progress as far as they're concerned. You're not exactly looking to build a cellar dweller. You're just looking to kind of get experience, get that big game experience for these younger guys night after night.
Yeah, and I think that's where the frustration comes from too, because when you look at where the Flyers are in regard to the rest of the league, this is a team that in terms of point total is tied for 25th in the league out of 31 teams. That's where frustration is coming from, because the way that the last few weeks have gone, the Flyers have gone from being that mildly competitive team, hanging in there in games, definitely getting some moral victories out of it. And if you go back to the game against Chicago, which was their 8th win of the season, so long ago already, but it was their 8th win of the season, and to that point, it's a team that's won 8 games. I believe they had lost 6 in regulation, and there was a couple in overtime, I believe it was. So I think they were, at that point, 8-6-2. And you're going, that's not a bad place to be. You can look at some of the regulation losses. The shutout loss to LA, the shutout loss to Nashville, the wild 6-5 loss to Nashville. All of those games that were regulation losses, you sat there and you could kind of go really close, signs of a team that's just not quite there yet, but getting there, and you could kind of almost pull from that and go, all right, progress is there. The overtime losses, same thing. Since then, it's been very hard to do that over the course of 7 games where you just see the same things happening. You don't see any form of adjustment. You don't see any form of change. And for a team that should be mildly competitive, at that time, at 8-6-2, as a team that had been competitive in pretty much all but 2 games in their entire season to that point, this was a team that was hovering right outside the wild card spot. And okay, if they were the last team on the outside looking in at the playoff picture, I think people would be willing to accept that, based on the fact that there are teams that are better equipped to make the playoffs now than the Flyers are. Yeah, this is a team developing, we get that. But it slipped so quickly that now all of a sudden the Flyers are essentially turning into a lottery team. That's not where this was supposed to go. This is a step backwards for a group. I do think to an extent, and Rob, we've talked about this a little bit, I know, on the show before, that when the Flyers made the playoffs in Hackstall's first year as head coach, they kind of fell into that spot more than they did, fight and claw their way in. They had to win a lot of games, no question about it, but there was a lot of things that went right around the rest of the league for them to make the playoffs that year. And then they gave Washington a pretty decent fight in the playoffs, and that gave you hope for the following year. And this team last year, weighted down by a lot of players who were roadblocks for younger players, seemed to be the reason. And that was always I think that was always the reasoning behind them not being a playoff team last season. It was, well, you got anchors holding them down, and when you look at defensemen and you go, I can point out 2 defensemen who aren't going to be here next year. That's going to make a difference. That opens the door for younger players. Here's a couple forwards who shouldn't be here next year. That opens the door. That whole concept, and that's exactly the way the offseason played out. They ended up picking up, as luck would have it, they got what turned into a lottery pick. They get the 2nd overall pick. That turns into a player who factors into your plans immediately. They have other players who are coming close, and in a sense, they did dip into the minor leagues and the Lehigh Valley Phantoms at this current stage that we're talking right now for 2 other players that are on the roster, among forwards at least. Defensively, they have 3 rookies dressing, not to mention a 2nd year and a 3rd year, so 5 out of your 6 defensemen are all in the 25 and under category, and at this point, you've got a very young team again. But I think the problem is that over the course of time, you want to see them get better at certain things. You want to see them develop into a team that proves to be that near contender, that borderline playoff team with the players that are going to be part of the future. And it's starting to look like those players are just kind of getting lost in the shuffle, or, like I said, mistakes are going to happen and they're going to cost you goals in a game at some point. But this team has really struggled to overcome a lot of adversity. It seems like a couple of injuries really did them in early. You sit here and you think the McDonald injury is not going to be something that hurts tremendously. It really did. It turned into something that's totally changed the course of the season to this point, because they were fairly respectable going into that. And, they had won their 5th game in the same game that McDonald got hurt. They were 5-3-0 at the time. They managed to kind of stay afloat for the next couple games, but they really have struggled lately. And it's the whole concept here. This is a team that needs to find a way, but finding a way is only as good as the players you have. And that's why, like I said, rebuilding is a really complicated term, because if you want to call the team a contender that isn't performing to your liking, then what? Is it? It's the players that are the problem? So why don't you find a way to fix that and not, find a way to fix that? Get somebody else up here who you think is going to make a difference. And they've tried that to some extent, but that it's just going to kind of keep shuffling back the other way when players start coming back. When McDonald comes back, who does that shuffle out of the defensive picture? When you have the forwards the way that you want them, I think Danik Martel being called up was a little bit more of a gut check move, kind of to try to spark the team even more. And he's definitely a spark plug. There's no question about it. But you look at that, and that was kind of an interesting move. Seemed like to try to wake the team up a little bit. But I look at this and I go, if you're going to tell me it's not the players, then it's the coaching? Well, what is it? There's got to be something that's not clicking here, one way or the other. And I don't know if it's coaching from the top down, as in the head coach and then the assistants to go with it. Is it something with what the assistant coaches are doing? It's easy. It's pretty easy to turn your head to Ian LaPerriere when the penalty kill goes as cold as it did over the course of a 3-game stretch. It's gotten a little bit better over time, but not to the point where they're, not taking away a team's power play completely. So, this is a case where, for Dave Haxtell, and I said this at the beginning of the year, this is a big year for Haxtell and Ron Hextall. They needed to see this team start to turn a corner, and they're going the other direction. So that's why this is becoming mainly concerning here. And, from the very beginning after Friday's game, Haxtell tried to pull out positives. You can't turn that direction. He gave a better answer to it later in his press conference about how the team has to start, it's to focus on the little things and doing everything possible to win a game and finish off a game and keep moving forward and doing all that. But at what point does it also turn into an Andy Reid press conference? Because I heard Haxtell say better job in there at one point in time, and he also just went straight to the points in 7 out of 10 games. That's not a moral victory in this division, because let's put it this way, in 2 games against the Islanders where the Flyers had a chance to try to start to right the ship and could have easily gained back some points on a team like the Islanders, you gave them 2 points instead because you lost both games in overtime, so the 2 points you got didn't matter. So, I'm curious, Rob, as to what your thoughts are on all of this. It's the middle of a losing streak, which just increases frustration, but the fact of being a rebuilding team, realistically, as what you are, but not admitting it, and giving the impression that you should be better, then what does that, where do you see the problem lying? Is it the players? Is it the coaching? Is it collective right now? What's your thought?
I think it's absolutely the talent. There wasn't a whole lot of talent to work with aside from, your Giroux, your Voracek, your Simmons, your Gostisbehere, all these guys that, we do know well enough by now that these guys do have talent, but it's one of those things where, when it comes down to it, it's still a very youthful lineup. You're not sending a whole team of all-stars out there just yet. It's one of those things where, these guys are developing. These guys still have, are still learning the ropes for the most part. They haven't seen a whole lot. Even guys like Ivan Provorov, who, they're younger, but they're still looking really steady, really solid. It's one of those things where they still, they haven't, seen all there is to see just yet. They're going to go through a lot of stuff. They're going to be going through adversity. And, when you look at it, it's one of those things where, as frustrating as it is, when you kind of look at the overall picture, one thing that doesn't exactly help the Flyers out is that they are playing in the toughest division in hockey right now. The Metropolitan Division is, when you have teams that were going to be proven to be bona fide teams this year, like Pittsburgh and Washington, Columbus, and then all of teams like a team like New Jersey, who just came out of nowhere to really be somewhat of a juggernaut, at least until the other shoe drops. It's one of those things where it's not something you can necessarily blame. You can't really blame this streak and this stretch on that, but the Flyers right now, they're only 10 points out of they're only 10 points behind the first place Devils. It's certainly not the worst case scenario. I mean, obviously, you can't just easily go get 10 points out of nowhere and make a charge on that. But it's one of those things where it looks like the sky is falling. There's no doubt about that. But it's one of those things where it could be a lot worse than it really is for them right now. So, and obviously, like you're saying about points in 7 out of 10 games, that is no moral victory. I do agree with you there. But it's one of those things where you don't want this to get any worse. But it's not anybody's picture of what ideal is right now. And nobody wants to be sitting in last place at this point in the season. But they do have there are some factors. They're in a tough division. And it's one of those things where they'll be able to try to correct themselves. You can only hope that they do it sooner rather than later. But it's one of those things where when it comes down to it, you just have to hope that it's not necessarily a coaching thing. I mean, the players seem to be still responding pretty well to what Hackstall's going for, but it's still not their most talented lineup that they're able to ice out there.
Well, and I do want to clarify one thing that I just said about it's no moral victory getting points in 7 of 10 games. That's also when you bring that up after your 7th straight loss. There's a lot of games during this losing streak where if that was we got the point out of it, we got one, just couldn't get the other, and you're looking at a moral victory, I can pull a few moral victories from the games if they were spaced apart more over the course of a season where you go, that's a really decent effort. I thought that the road game against the Islanders on Wednesday, that's a great effort to get a point, and you didn't quite get the chance to finish it off in overtime, but it's not going to be viewed that way when it's your 6th straight loss. Same thing with the 7th one on Friday. You can't pull that as a moral victory when you've lost that many games in a row and haven't been able to finish something off. If you were in the middle of a stretch though where you're going, well, we've earned points in 7 out of 10 games, and out of those 10 games, 5 of them are wins, we got points in another 2, and we've, a 5-3-2 record over 10 games is not a horrible record. But having, I want to say they're I think they're 2-7 or 2-6-3 over the last, or something like that in the month of November. Or in November, they've been really bad. Is the point I'm making here, record wise. They haven't won games the way they need to. They have 2 wins in the entire month of November. And to your point, Rob, about the Metro as well, I want to kind of throw something out here because going into this game, and Pittsburgh did win on Saturday, convincingly over Tampa, by the way. But I look at this and I can't remember the last time this is the case. And not on the Flyers end for sure, because the Flyers have been, in and out of playoff pictures over the last 5, 6, 7 years now, really. But when was the last time the Flyers and Penguins both met at the same time, and neither was actually in the playoff picture, holding a playoff spot? Because Pittsburgh is the first team outside of the wild card with 27 points because the Metro is so good. And I do think that there is, to an extent, with New Jersey being the way that they've been so far this year, the Islanders have been really strong lately. You've seen elements of Washington and Pittsburgh and the Rangers being slightly different than they were in years past. Still playoff contenders, no question about it, but those teams I don't think are near as much of the, Columbus has been really good this year too. That's the team I think right now, Columbus being, because Jersey's off to such a hot start that it's hard to see if they're going to sustain that right now. That's the big question for them is how well can they sustain such a good start. Columbus, on the other hand, was doing this last year in the regular season and seems to be continuing to do that. So they might be the class of the Metropolitan Division here, with the Devils and the Islanders being teams on the rise that are in the top 3. With Washington, Pittsburgh, and the Rangers all kind of vying for those last 2 spots as wild card teams, it is a little bit of a shifting of the guard here in the sense that Washington's not the President's Trophy winners that they were over the last couple of years. And Pittsburgh, even though they are the defending Stanley Cup champions, and even though they've got the best player in the game right now in terms of career track record in Crosby and Phil Kessel and Evgeny Malkin, and the list goes on and on, there's a reason that they're where they are right now in the standings, too. So it's not completely... To me, the Metro hasn't provided complete clarity yet. But the Flyers are starting to show some if they continue to let this streak frustrate them and not, We've said it already tonight a little bit, If there's any team that the Flyers can go out there and take some frustration out on, it's Pittsburgh. This is the rivalry that draws a lot of attention. You've got, one of the cool things about the next few months here, and into the course of the next year, because it's over a year away, but there will be another outdoor game between these two teams. It's something that just keeps fueling the rivalry. And if there's a time for the Flyers to go out there and really bring it and bring one of their best games, it's going to be this one. And then seeing if they can feed that into a strong game on Tuesday, and then having a nice pause to get back into the swing of things. Also, another game on home ice against Boston. But Boston's been kind of the same, almost a similar team to the Flyers in a sense, because Boston just came out slower than the Flyers did and have since really turned things around and gotten a lot better in the last few weeks. So, and Boston was also plagued with injuries over the course of time as well. So, a couple different things to look at with that, but, I mean, to me, it's a personnel issue player-wise in the sense that they're so young that we have to be willing to understand that there's a learning curve with everything, and mistakes are going to happen. This is true. But at the same time, when a losing streak stretches the way that it has, you start to lose hope in a coaching staff for being able to flip the switch on the team. They've had their moments, but they haven't had that 60-minute effort that's going to get them out of a losing streak. That's what they need to do in the course of the next week. So, Rob, one thing I want to do right now, I guess, is let's start to turn the corner here, look ahead to some of these other games coming up, and just where this team is going to be. Because we've talked about how the positioning in the standings around American Thanksgiving is really the indicator for teams that are going to be there. And that's, that very well may be true, but you look at the logjam of teams that are in the Eastern Conference right now, the Flyers could easily, with a win in their next couple games, in these back-to-backs, go from 22 to 26 points and be knocking on the door of being a playoff team. It's that, they're 6 points back of the final wild card spot that the Rangers are holding, and the Rangers have played 24 games. Washington's played 25. There's room for them to make it up here, but they need to kind of get on a roll quickly. And what do you see as the best way to being able to do that? Is this just more mental than anything and putting it behind them, or is there something that they need to be doing execution-wise here and learning from the mistakes, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, a lot of it. I mean, I think that the mental aspect can kind of tie hand in hand with learning from mistakes. It's one of those things where, when you look at it, when you look at how sloppy they've been in the third period, this is all stuff you can learn from. This is all stuff you can work on to try and be a better hockey club. So it's one of those things where, it's not exactly it's not something you can really do overnight. Just kind of shake out of that pretty quickly. But it's one of those things where it takes a little bit of time. It's a little budding, and it starts with these little victories. Getting those bounces, winning those battles in the corner, and just basically playing a tighter game. If you have a lead in the third period, it's one of those things where, like I mentioned the other day, I was watching that Black Friday game against the Islanders, and I see they have a 2-goal lead at the second intermission. I'm like, all right, well, they're going to blow this one. And it's one of those things where just because of how they've played in third period throughout this streak, just how sloppy they've been, taking those penalties, and just overall just kind of being worn down, kind of running out of steam in the third, whatever it may be. It's a whole number of factors. It's not exactly one singular thing. It's one of those things where, you learn from those mistakes. You kind of pick yourself up off of those errors and just move forward from there.
Yeah, it's well said there, Rob, because of the fact that it's a team that at the moment hasn't lost all these games on one particular issue. It's not just defensive. It's not just penalty kill. It's not just a lack of secondary scoring. All things that are problems with the team. This is a collective issue, and you get a game like the Black Friday game where the Flyers go out and get 4 goals, have a 4-2 lead after 2 periods. They've done their part on the offensive side, and the defensive side just doesn't finish it off. One thing, and let me see if you agree with this, Rob, because I've seen a lot of people who instantly point out goaltending. I think it's because it's kind of like a crutch to think that the goaltending is a problem. I don't know about you. I mean, look, the one game Michael Neuvirth got a shot to be the starter, he was horrible in that game, and they rightfully yanked him from the game before anything else happened. But in the games that Brian Elliott has started in the last few weeks, he might tell you there's goals he wants to have back, but really there's a lot of games here where I haven't really seen much. I especially look at the games If you go back to where this all started with the back-to-back shutout losses to Minnesota, where Elliott was only responsible for allowing the one goal in the 1-0 loss and one of the three in the 3-0 loss in Minnesota. He was really on the end of the hard luck loss, the last-minute loss, really, and it was a shootout loss, but they gave up the tying goal in the final minute of regulation in Winnipeg. That's a game where he only allows 2 goals during that regulation time. And the game against Calgary was just kind of him being left out to dry. So I don't see Brian Elliott as being a problem for this team because he's played well enough to give this team winning efforts in, well, really, both Minnesota games, the Winnipeg game, things like that. You know, he's probably been good enough to win upwards of 3 or 4 of these games easily on the 7-game losing streak. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you look at Elliott and, you know, it's not like he's been incredible. He's had his moments where, you know, he'll just let up some really rough-looking goals or just kind of almost have like an off game or anything along those lines. And then he'll have, you know, he'll just be dazzling, you know, saves left and right and just looking incredible out there. And it's one of those things where, you know, I don't want to say he's I don't want to call it inconsistency. I don't really know what the word for that would be, but it's one of those things where, you know he's capable of doing a lot out there, and then, you know, he'll let in, you know, a couple of soft goals, you know, a couple of fluke goals, and you just kind of wonder how those went in.
Yeah, and I mean, what I look at more over this stretch of time is that in the games that he started, there's been a few where he's let in a lot of goals, no question about it, but at the same time, I look and I go, usually a lot of defensive lapses come into play with that as well. It's not just him, it's defensive positioning as well, it's missed assignments, things like that. And goals that are scored on the man advantage while your team is trying to kill a penalty are difficult as well, especially if they can do quick cycle of the puck and get you out of position. My thing with this is just that I don't see Brian Elliott as being the problem, you know, not, or at least the main problem. There have been moments where he's going to want to have a chance to make a save on a shot that he should have stopped. No question about it. But I don't attribute this 7-game losing streak as a goaltending issue. I like I said, I think this is a personnel issue that goes team-wide. It's games where they didn't get scoring from forwards. It's games where the defensive play hasn't been good. It's games where the goaltending has left something to be desired. It's games where discipline is bad. It's games where the penalty kill is bad, where they lose the special teams battle. It's a little bit of everything. And until everything starts to click on one side or the other, that's what you're going to get. And I don't think you're going to be able to snap this losing streak by putting it all together in one game. You're going to have to put a lot of it together, and there's still going to be a spot where you're going to have to fight your way out of it, but you're going to need to take that win and treasure it and build off of it very quickly. And that's where I see that kind of going as the next week goes on. Just that the Flyers need to come out on Monday, starting on this Monday game against Pittsburgh, with the mindset that this is the first game for them. Almost like, you know, pretend it's like a season opener. You have a clean slate. You don't, obviously, at this stage of the season, but pretend it is, and act like this is the start of a new streak, and see where that goes. It's hard. It's hard to do when you've lost 7 games in a row to get that mental mindset to be that way. But this is where they are right now, and this is what they need to snap out of. It's definitely a challenge. It's definitely something that's going to test some of the fortitude of this team, and certainly I've called it trial by fire in the sense that the Flyers have so many young players that have to learn on the fly. You really don't have much of a choice other than to see what they've got in the moment here. But winning will breed confidence, and losing 7 straight tends to just deflate everything. It knocks all the confidence right out of you. So the Flyers need to get some of that confidence back. Maybe Pittsburgh is the right medicine for it. I don't know. But there's a lot of questioning going on right now, and a few wins to snap out of this will change a lot of that. But somewhere in here, you need to start with consecutive wins of some sort, I would think, and see what we can talk about otherwise. But, give us something else to talk about other than a losing streak, because right now, I look around, and this is interesting. I look around the city at the other teams in the city. You know, if you were like us, you probably spent your Sunday afternoon watching the Eagles win another game. You know, and for that team, there's a team that's 10-1 on their way to the playoffs, on their way to winning a division, on their way to probably a long playoff run. That generates excitement. The Sixers have been great in the last few weeks. They've been really building something strong. Their last 10 games, they're 7-3, and that's the same kind of method. A team that's young, a team that's got players that are still in development, but players that are performing at the top level as well, that turn the tide on it a little bit, and make you start to think that the team's heading in the right direction. Even while the Phillies are in the offseason, you got a new manager, you got a new voice. It's kind of like a new beginning for the team in a sense, and it's like, okay. And then the Flyers are this team that kind of are dragging the hope of the city down a little bit, and that's why you need to go out there and regain some of it back, because people are closing the door on this team already, and I don't blame people for doing it. I can understand why, but there's a lot of time left in this season, and I agree with the players that say that there's a lot of time left, but if you're going to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. That's kind of where it is at this point. So, Rob, as we get ready to wrap up this week, any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, obviously, as we've been harping on, nobody wants to be in this point at this particular juncture of the season. Nobody. You look at the 123 professional clubs in North America. Nobody wants to be in last place. It's frustrating. There's no doubt about that. But it's one of those things where it is salvageable. Just there's no sense in just taking the L for the season and just kind of packing it in. Now this is something where it's adversity. In the long run, it is good for these young guys to go through. As frustrating as it is, it's a learning opportunity for them, and I'm curious as to see how they'll bounce back. I think that they'll do quite all right for themselves in that regard.
Well, let's hope so, because they really do need to bounce back. And I do think that a team that goes on to maybe not make the playoffs here, but can find their way back into it after a stretch like this, that becomes a little bit more of a positive and a bit of a victory in a sense. If you look at a season-long progression where you were this far out of the picture, this far down, and managed to work your way back, that's something that makes a difference, but it's going to be really challenging, and I don't know. I mean, to me, I think major change is required if they somehow find a way to do the opposite of what you just said, which is take the L for the season at the end of November here and don't find a way to get out of this. That to me is when major change is required, but otherwise everybody should be fighting for their lives here, both playing in this city and for this team and any job that anybody has with it. Everybody's got to put their best self forward here and put their best foot forward from here on out at this point. That's pretty much where we're at with this. And it's frustrating, it's discouraging, it's disappointing, and it would be great for us to go back and have a show like we did a few weeks into the season where everything seemed to be firing on all cylinders, everything seemed to be wonderful, everything seemed to be off to a great start, and now here we are at the end of November kind of having the same conversations and using the same narratives as in seasons past. It's really showing a lack of progress that people want to see, and here's hoping that changes very quickly. So that's going to wrap things up for the Flyerdelphia podcast for this week. We will be back with you next Monday night. We're taking the Sunday off just because, as we mentioned, if you were like us, we spent the Sunday afternoon watching the Eagles go to 10-1. With the Eagles playing a night game, a lot of focus is obviously going to shift there. So we're going to kind of clear the stage for the Philadelphia Eagles and football for that night on our site's side at least. As a 4-for-4 here. We'll come back on Monday, actually leading into the start of the Flyers' Western Canada road trip there. They'll be playing the Calgary Flames on that Monday night, December 4th at 9 o'clock. We'll be on with you at 8 o'clock and taking you right up to the start of that game at 9. So that should be a great way to get that kind of rolling off a little bit and be kind of a way to continue some things we're trying to work on here. We're going to try to start getting some things utilizing Facebook Live. If you've been viewing the videos, the post-game videos that we've been doing from Wells Fargo Center following some of the home games, we do appreciate that, and there will be more to come in the coming weeks as well. But otherwise, that's going to do it for this week. For Rob Riches, I'm Kevin Durso. Thank you for tuning in to the Flyerdelphia podcast. We'll be back with you next week on Monday, December 4th at 8 o'clock. So thank you guys for tuning in. Have a great week, and we'll be back next week to talk more Flyers hockey. This has been the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. This has been another edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heenan, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com.